mute yourself. We will have the opportunity for questions, and you'll be able to pose those questions in the chat. And lastly, as Kelly has mentioned, self-care is really essential in our work. I'm going to provide right now 2 telephone numbers. So please take care of yourself during the presentation and then after today's presentation. And feel free to use these numbers, reach out for support because people are here for you and want to help. Thank you.
Thank you, Kara. So NAMI Marin started a storytelling series a year ago, and they were beautiful events. We will have them again one day, but part of the environment, and Mark was one of our storytellers, so feel free to pop anything in the chat, Mark, if you have things to share in this regard too. But part of what we try to create is an environment of compassion, non-judgment, respect, curiosity, and support. So any storyteller we've ever had participate in this series, they're not professional speakers. And even if they were professional speakers, they're talking about their personal lives. So that just means that we as a community, our job is to support them and to be there for them and to be as kind and compassionate as possible while doing what Kara said, which is to take care of ourselves, because when we hear stories, that increases our empathy. It can also challenge us in ways that we didn't expect. It can bring up a lot of emotions. So we're really just here to be together in the best way that we know how online. But make sure you reach out to us if you need some support. Reach out, have somebody in mind to call and let them know that you were on this call today and what you learned, what came up for you. And then also, we're going to give our utmost love, kindness, and respect to David and Rick today as they tell us about their lives. And before we get started with that, I am honored to be the co-chair of the Suicide Prevention Collaborative with my dear friend and colleague, Kara Connors, who is the Suicide Prevention Coordinator for the County of Marin. So she's going to tell you a little bit about that initiative.
Thank you, Kelly. Some of you are new and some of you are familiar to me, but if you are not already aware, Marin County launched a Suicide Prevention Collaborative in August. We had our second meeting this past September, and our next meeting is October 7th at 2 p.m. And this is really an illustration, excuse me, of the collaborative made up of public and private sector individuals and agencies, from crisis managers to allies to loss survivors, teachers, administrators, people in business, across the board. Because we know when we talk about suicide prevention, it really requires a multi-sectoral approach to this major public health issue. The goal of the collaborative is to carry out the strategic plan that was approved in February. And that strategic plan is made up of 7 core strategies that are reflected here. Going back to the collaborative for a minute, as Kelly mentioned, she is one of the co-chairs, and our other co-chair is Amit Rajaparia, who's the medical director in Marin County. And the core of the collaborative is really made up of several community teams. And those teams that we're launching with right now will be communication, data, training, education, postvention in schools. And so if you're just interested in learning more about the collaborative, I highly encourage you to join us on October 7th. It's an opportunity for us to do community building, learn, as well as hear updates and progress from our community teams and the important work that they are carrying out. You can advance the slide. And this picture here is our Suicide Prevention Recovery and Recovery Month events that we've been holding all month to date. We have 2 more events after today's event, and I encourage you to join. September 29th, this presentation will be communicated in Spanish, and that'll be led by Maria Rea, who's a fantastic clinician, and Berta Campos, who is with North Marin Community Services. And then on September 30th, we will have a focus on suicide and substance use prevention. and talk about specific roles that people can play in their community. And that'll be presented by Dr. Jeff DeVito, as well as one of our community partners, Linda Henn at Marin Healthy Youth Partnership, and myself. So that is a mouthful, but I hope to see you at some of these future events. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Kara. And our other partners are the team at Road of Shalom. So I believe Joanne, I can't see everybody when I'm sharing my screen. So if Moji's still here, and then Joanne is going to tell us a little bit about the beautiful work they've been doing in their faith community. One of the reasons it's important for us at NAMI to highlight our partnerships is because there are so many wonderful things happening throughout the community in beautiful and creative ways. So it was exciting for us to uplift that today. So Joanne.
Thanks, Kelly. So I'm Joanne Foreman. I'm the Real Mental Health Initiative Program Coordinator at Congregation Road of Shalom in San Rafael. And Real it's our mental health initiative at Road of Shalom. And our mission is, as you see on the screen, to decrease the stigma and isolation of mental illness and addiction in our Jewish community and beyond. There's really so much more that I could say about our program. But I think that one of the most important things is that since starting Real 6 years ago, we've seen a significant increase in the number of congregants who are coming forward and sharing their stories in many, many different ways with each other, with reporters, so that a greater number of people can hear about their stories, and at our services, because we know that stigma is reduced when we hear the stories of people who we know and who we can relate to. And we've really watched that grow and change over the years, and we're very proud of it. So we're very proud to be here in collaboration with you, and thanks for having us.
Thanks, Joanne. And Joanne's going to read our opening quote, which is from the book Sons of Suicide.
Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. Soren Kierkegaard.
So we wanted to start with a dedication. This is also from the book. This is a dedication to Rick and David's moms. And on the next page, you're going to see the dedication of our community members, those names that you sent in to us. It's really important to us that we make space for those that we've lost by suicide, and that we really ground ourselves in why we're all doing this work. So that also can be a sad and difficult memory, but there also can be things that were really bright, shining stars about the people we've lost, or about the things that we've survived. So you're going to see a video in just a second, and so please feel free to use the chat. Please feel free to turn your volume up or turn your volume down. Do whatever you need to do to really create an honoring space before we hear from Rick and David. So to the memory of Gloria Bernice Butensky Pincus and Dorothy Estelle Lipkin Knapp, we wish we understood. To all the survivors of suicide loss, you are not alone. To the power of friendship, for us, it made the difference.
Dum, 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 dum. Dum, 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 dum.
Here's to the ones that we got. Cheers to the wish you were here, but you're not, 'cause the dreams bring back all the memories of everything we've been through. Close to the ones here today, close to the ones that we lost on the way, 'cause the dreams bring back all the memories, and the memories bring back you. There's a time that I remember when I did not know no pain, when I believed in forever and everything would stay the same. Now my heart feel like December when somebody say your name, 'cause I can't reach out to call you, but I know I will one day, yeah.
Everybody hurts sometimes, everybody hurts someday, yeah. But everything will be alright. Always his voice will say, hey.
Here's to the ones that we got. Cheers to the wish you were here, but you're not. Cause the dreams bring back all the memories of everything we've been through. Close to the ones here today. Close to the ones that we lost on the way. Cause the dreams bring back all the memories. And the memories bring back you. Memories bring back
That was also chosen by Rick. So part of what we do in our storytelling series is make sure that the storytellers choose everything that we show. So I thought that was a lovely song and representative. And for me, it's so important that we include young people in these conversations. And so it all kind of came together. So now it's my honor to introduce these lovely gentlemen. You look like you're, I was gonna say a winery, but I don't think maybe that's the case. So thank you guys for being here. And I'd love to introduce Rick and David, who are the co-authors of Sons of Suicide. It's a memoir of friendship. They have been close friends since meeting as high school seniors more than 50 years ago. They both attended the University of Maryland as undergraduates, Rick in journalism and David in political science. Subsequently, Rick earned his MA in journalism at The Ohio State University, while David stayed at Maryland for his master's and PhD in organizational communication. Following stints in the U.S. Air Force and at AT&T, Rick's professional life was spent as a management consultant, partner and leader with global consulting firms Foster Higgins and Mercer, focusing on employee and organizational communications and human resources. He retired in 2002, but has yet to slow down. He serves on the boards of Cleveland Playhouse, America's first regional theater, and Idea Stream. I don't know what that is. We'll have to talk about that later. The public media organization in Northwest Ohio. Among his passions are photography, cooking, baseball, and travel. He and his wife Ellen still live in Cleveland. By contrast, David's professional life followed two distinctly different directions, yet also within the field of communication. The first was in business, most notably as Marriott's corporation's first organization-wide employee communication director. His later and longer role was in academia, where he held faculty and leadership positions in communication and business schools at Cal State Fullerton and the University of Southern California, then as an MBA director at the University of Arkansas Fayetteville. Now also retired, David and his wife Karen reside in Oceanside, California. And like Rick, Dave is an avid photographer, a huge baseball fan, and an ardent world traveler. So welcome, David and Rick.
Well, thank you very much. Kelly, I have to tell you, I like the first picture you showed of us better when David had hair and mine was dark. So this is a really important set of issues for us, that is reducing suicides, which are exploding at unbelievable rates, and helping those who are survivors of suicide loss like David and I are. So the work that you, Kelly, are doing at NAMI and with the collaborative in Marin County, and the Kara you're doing with the county and the collaborative, and that the pioneering work really that Rodef Shalom has done, is really very important and really inspirational in many respects. So thank you so much. I was also really inspired by and moved by that list of dedications and memories that were listed there. So there are a lot of us around who are survivors of suicide loss. And that's one of the central themes that David and I have gotten across through our book, we think, that we are not alone. We will tell you a little bit about our story, but I also want to invite anybody who would like to use the chat feature on Zoom to ask us questions. We'll answer as many as we can in the time allotted. And we also have a special email set up that you are welcome to use. We'd like to hear from you to answer questions that you may not be able to ask today, and to hear your stories as well. And that website is sonsofsuicide2020@gmail.com. sonsofsuicide2020@gmail.com. So David and I have been friends for a long time, but the precipitating events happened even before we were friends. And so David, why don't you start by telling a little bit about your story?
Okay, I will. My mother took her life 2 weeks after my 13th birthday. She was 35 years old. But for her, it had been an effort to end her life, most of her life. As I learned later, her first attempt had been at 16. How many after that, I'm not sure, but I know of at least 2 because I witnessed the aftermath. My father breaking down the front door to get her moments before she would have expired. The second time, I saw the pools of blood on the bathroom floor after she had cut her wrist with my father's razor. And after that time, she had been taken to a hospital. And so for over 2 months, I didn't see her or talk to her until she was given a furlough from the hospital to have lunch with my father, my younger sister, and I. And I can still see it. We were, it was a block from the hospital, kind of a seedy old cafe in Manhattan. It was noisy and smoky. And even as a boy of 13, confused and uncertain about what was to happen, I could see when my mother talked how troubled, how depressed she was. So much so that I took a mental snapshot of her as we parted, because I had a feeling it was going to be the last time that I saw her. And 2 weeks later, it turned out to be true. And in telling us about her death, my father never used the word suicide. It was embarrassing. The stigma at that time was overwhelming. Yet I knew. And afterwards, I was overtaken with grief, but also with a desire to know why. And even today, almost 60 years later,
Well, I think we lost David momentarily, unfortunately, due to some technological glitches. But I think what he was going to say is even today, 60 years later, that question of why still haunts him. And as I'll explain to you in a minute, also haunts me a bit. I was living in Kettering, Ohio, just outside Dayton, when my mother took her life. I was 14 at the time. She had gone to a hotel in Dayton for a couple nights R&R, as my father explained it to us. And my sister and my father and I drove to pick her up. We parked in a parking garage adjacent to the hotel. My dad went in to get her and bring her back, and he said, "I'll be back in just a couple minutes." But it was an awfully long time. And a couple minutes turned into more than 10 minutes, more than 20 minutes. And I tried entertaining my younger sister, who was 9 years old at the time. And, we told jokes, we told stories, we counted the how many blue cars were coming into the parking garage. And eventually I saw my dad walking down the ramp of the garage with our rabbi. My dad's head bowed. And I knew right away that something was horribly, horribly wrong. After my mother's suicide, I was really in a fog. I don't know how better to describe the emotions that I had. Looking back on it, I know that I missed her terribly, that I may have felt abandoned, that I didn't understand what was going on, why she had passed away, let alone why she might have taken her own life. I was confused, but mostly I was in a fog. Things were going slow motion most of the time, or sometimes they would speed up at double or triple speed. It really was indescribable. As a fairly immature 14-year-old, I couldn't process all of that. And there was practically nobody to talk to. Like David's father, my father never used the word suicide. He, of course, was going through his own grief and was worried about taking care of the children and his job and what to do now. So he couldn't really talk to him. And he also was not a person who was very open and emotional about things. He felt like he needed to move on. He needed to be very stoic, as many men did at the time and still do. So it was a very difficult time. My younger sister was too young to talk too much, although I remember sitting in the sanctuary of our synagogue when we went to Sunday school. If we got there a little bit early, we'd go into the synagogue and it would be dark except for the eternal light, and we'd just sit there and pray some. But I want to fast forward now for two and a half years later. My father had gotten remarried. He had a new job in Washington, D.C., so we moved to the Maryland suburbs of Washington. And then he was asked to coordinate an assignment for his company in Hawaii. So we all moved to Hawaii for an undetermined period of time, which turned out to be about 7 months. And then in March of my senior year, we moved back to Maryland. So I was back at the school that I'd gone to in my junior year. And I went to the assigned corner to catch the bus. And I was standing on the corner and I saw a couple of teenagers diagonally across the corner from us. And then a few more teenagers assembling. And then I started wondering if I was in the right place. And some voice rang out and he said, "Hey, you going to Duval?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "Over here." And it was David. And so our first introduction to each other was him thinking that I was really a dumb guy for standing on the wrong corner. We wound up sitting next to each other on the bus and just starting to get acquainted a little bit. We discovered we both were born in New York City and we both liked baseball. He was a Dodgers fan. At the time I was a Yankees fan. So we had some things to reconcile there. And we would talk on the way home from school. And then within a week or so, we were at his aunt and uncle's house where David was living at the time. And we're talking, and for some reason, we opened up a little bit. And David had the courage to tell me that his mother had died by suicide. And I confessed that my mother had too, only a few years before. And it created a tremendous bond and a sense of enormous relief that there was somebody who had a very similar experience, who could really identify, with whom we could each open up. We could, it was like a pressure cooker. And if you've ever used a pressure cooker, you take that little plug off the top and steam is released. And we could talk to each other. We could say anything we wanted, or we could say nothing. And there was still that sense of relief, of friendship, of kinship. And it was just an enormous relief. And David, I don't know if you are back on now and able to talk a little bit about the situation and how you felt at the time.
Well, I think you described it really well, Rick, and I don't say that to him all that often, so realize I'm telling you the truth. Opening up to one another was, at the time, a revelation for us because we had held it in. There was no one we could talk to, certainly no one else who understood what it felt like to be left behind that way and what it did to one. And so when we discovered each other, it was like suddenly being able to share the secret, to share the burden that we had been carrying. And
well, it looks like David has frozen again. So while he tries to get back on, why don't we go ahead and start entertaining some questions? Because I think that's the most important thing that we can do today. We'd like to hear from people who have questions about our situation or about their own situations, or to share some experiences with us.
So Rick, let me kick that off. And just for the group, what you're seeing between, this is, it's kind of apropos that David is freezing and he's back, I see him now, but Rick and David can complete each other's sentences. So what's beautifully highlighted in their book, Sons of Suicide, and their relationship is their incredible friendship, and how much that tragic commonality that they had really provided so much healing for them. So for me, it's, I wish, David, that wasn't happening, but it just shows how much you two can, your friendship, which, I was saying earlier in the emails, they just sign off for each other. So don't feel like you're not getting the full story. So I think what would be great to kind of highlight now that you've sort of told the backstory and how you met, a great question is that when you met, you were both teenagers. You were two boys, untrained in therapy or psychology, yet you say you were able to help one another when no one else could. So can you talk about how that happened?
Sure. That degree of trust that we built up at the beginning has lasted now decades, and we have rarely lived in the same city over time. We both finished college at the University of Maryland, but then I was away for a few years, and we both lived in Maryland for a few years after that. Since then, we haven't. So the fact that we could be open with each other and non-judgmental with each other was really critically important. And we've been asked before what advice we would give if you're grappling with a problem like this, or somebody who is, and that being open to hearing what's going on is really valuable, and not being judgmental about it. One of the challenges I think I would have had with my father, had he even wanted to talk about it, was he was an engineer. Everything was kind of black and white. He was a World War II veteran. He fought in the war. It was, come on, just get over it. You got to move on, which wouldn't have been a satisfactory answer. But at the time that David and I met, there were many fewer resources available to us. And I think our fathers would have been very reluctant to have us go see a psychologist. There was a stigma around going to see a psychologist, and also around mental health issues and around suicide. As a matter of fact, when my mother died by suicide, my father knew the editor of the Dayton Daily News at the time, as an Air Force Reserve buddy. And my dad called the newspaper, called his friend, the editor, and said, please, in any news report about the police coming to the hotel or any kind of story you write about this, please don't mention that it was suicide. But for David and me, we could talk, and what you'll see on our book, the cover of our book, and what you saw in one of the photos there is that we were sitting on a bench. Benches wound up being our psychologist couches, ironically. We kind of didn't realize that until we wrote the book and saw how often benches were a recurring theme. So benches wound up being our psychologist couches, and David and I wound up being each other's counselors.
Yeah, and I think what was critical to that was that we were able to trust one another from the start, and it meant so much. In fact, I remember, as Rick mentioned, I was living with my aunt and uncle at the time we met, and I remember telling her about Rick and this amazing conversation that we had and the coincidence in our lives. And she began crying because she knew how much I needed to be able to talk to someone, but hadn't been able to find one. And so for us, it was initially the commonality of our mother's suicide, but it became much more over the course of the next 50, 60 years. I mean, how old are we now, Rick?
Well, you're older, so it's okay.
I'm older by 6 months. He never lets me forget it. But it became something in life that we could always fall back on, the ability to open up. And sometimes we needed to be told things that we had lost sight of, and that's where we would also serve one another. And Sons of Suicide, the title of the book, doesn't only refer to the two of us. We came across two other friends a little bit later in life who also lost parents to suicide, one of whom Rick and I were close friends with for over 20 years before it accidentally slipped out one day that he too had lost a parent to suicide. And he had no idea that we had lost parents to suicide. So that notion of not opening up, not sharing, bucking up as men are supposed to, we saw it there in a way that reminded us to this day how hard it is to talk about it. As I mentioned before, I think it was much easier for us to write the book than it is to do something like this today, because we can see faces, we can hear ourselves talk, which is another part of opening up. When you hold it inside, it doesn't have to be scrutinized. You don't have to question your own words, but when you do share it, others will react, you'll get other perspectives. And maybe most importantly, you hear your own words for the first time, and they become far more real than what you imagine in your own mind.
Kelly, are there other questions that we can answer?
Yes, and I'm glad you brought up Dennis and Tommy, because such an evolution of the book, which is your real life true story, is adding to this group of friends that can talk honestly. And there are some other questions I'm going to get to, but I have one that really struck me. I mean, there's many things that struck me about the book I've shared with you and will share with the community, that there is a level of emotional intelligence that you learned through your friendship that really should be the model for what we could do community-wide. That would be my dream. And the people on this call who know me are not surprised that I would have that large of a dream. But you really break it down in this beautiful, beautiful way. So there's this exchange, and I want to kind of dive into that a little bit because one of the questions people have is like, what advice do you have for folks who are loss survivors or who are struggling? I know many people on this call. I know those that I know who are loss survivors and how difficult that has been. But there's an exchange in the book where one of you say, and I can't remember which one. But this is what I love about it, that you morph into each other. But one of you asks a question and you say, that's a big question. And then the other one says, any conclusions? And then you have this exchange over many paragraphs in the book, and you keep asking those two questions, or that statement, that's a big question, any conclusions? And what I really found so beautiful about that was the tenacity to continue to hear a challenging story and to continue to work through the uncomfortableness together and really make space for that. Because as you both mentioned, this is still really difficult for you to talk about, but yet you keep dancing with each other in that difficulty, and you remain there for each other. So can you talk a little bit about what that has looked like for you and how you sort of developed that, and what advice you would have for others?
Well, I think over many years that trust has just grown, that knowledge of each other, not only about our mother's deaths, obviously, but about our lives. We have, and I should say that, and I say something like this in the book, there's no question that my mother's suicide affected me in many ways, and in ways that I can't even recognize. But it didn't define me. It influenced who I am, but it did not define me. So David and I both have had great lives. We had wonderful careers. We have terrific friends, very close friends. We have great families. We've been able to do all kinds of things, some of them together. Our families sometimes have traveled together. And maintaining that over time, we've been told by a number of people that's really unusual for men to have that kind of close friendship, that it's women who more often bond and are very emotionally open. And you know who's told us that is our wives and other women who have read the book. So, and
they're right.
Go ahead, David.
And they're right.
And they're right, yeah. David said that it was much easier writing the book than talking publicly about it, but it wasn't easy writing the book either. And indeed, there were memories that we brought up that maybe we'd never talked to each other about or hadn't thought about in years. And, I shared an early draft of the book with my sister, who was able to remind me of some things that I didn't remember. Or had a different viewpoint of things, which is perfectly legitimate. And I think the same thing happened with David as he shared the book.
Yeah, the book was its own catharsis for us, and we had no idea that it would be that way. When we would get to memories of certain conversations or events, we would start trying to probe each other's memories. Are you sure about that? I remember it this way or that way, and we would reconstruct as much as we could. Or if there was another friend or a relative we could check with, we would ask them what their memories were, and in remembering it now, so many years later, we remembered many things differently. For instance, one of the, I think, amazing revelations for all four of us in doing this, the other two weren't directly involved in the putting together of the book, but they are very much in it because a main portion of it was a four-way email exchange that first brought the four of us all together. And it was an outpouring over 2 weeks' time that we could never reconstruct, but fortunately we had saved. And in doing that, we all realized that we were forgiving our parents more now than we ever had because we better understood how they were driven by a mental illness that at the time was not nearly as understood as it is today. And we had never put it within that context, but now we were able to do that, and it changed the way we look back. And the book itself, we originally wrote only intending to share it with our close friends and our family. But when our wives read it, they were our first readers, our most trusted and critical readers. They said to us, as Rick pointed out, number one, men don't tend to talk this way, and you have to share this with more people. And we were a bit taken back. We weren't quite sure about that. So we went through our own little research effort to have other readers, many of whom didn't know us, read it and give us feedback. And lo and behold, we began to come around to believe that this was worth trying to share with others. And last note on this is that once the book was done, and we then shared it with some of the family and close friends, some of the feedback that we got surprised us, and we now cherish. One example is that I shared the initial manuscript with my son, and he stayed up all night reading it and called me the next day and said, "Thank you for giving this to me. It's all new to me." And I was floored. I had no idea how little I had spoken to him about. And I asked him why, or what he thought. And he said, "Well, I always sensed that it was a taboo subject and that it was painful for you. So I never asked." Fortunately, a few months later, when I visited him, we went off together and we caught up to a great degree, but it still hangs with me that I was unaware of how much I had held in, even to those as close to me as my son. And Rick, you and your sister and brother similarly.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're highlighting all of these different components. We can ask questions about sort of the specifics of how we heal, but you're talking about permission, right? Like permission to say the things that we haven't been able to say before. We're talking about building trust over time, not expecting us to be different in one day, allowing our grief space and time to grow and be. And then you're also talking about this really beautiful awareness that we're not born with, and in fact, we're socialized against, that you're also growing over time. So when you can write this book that I didn't know that it was just intended for your family, that you have given to the world, that you are showing the process of that in those really small moments. And I think that's how we combat a lot of the gender specific training that we all have too, which I want to talk about in a second, but I just want to highlight this comment from Jessica that says, "Thank you for your thoughts on verbalizing. I agree that bearing witness, verbalizing and telling your story, and having someone listen without talking or giving advice is part of healing. It is so important. Verbalizing is part of healing, and writing is also." So again, like just highlighting and why I changed the word from "here is where we can tell our stories" to "where can we tell our stories safely," because creating spaces where we can safely tell our stories, even when, you know, we're online and there's tech issues, or you're in person and your voice shakes, or, you know, whatever that, the messiness of that is where we get to the beautiful parts of how we heal.
Kelly, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to add that one other aspect of that is not only verbalizing, but also hearing someone else's story.
Mm-hmm.
I think that really helped David and me to know that it was okay to talk, to hear someone else's story, to know you're not alone.
Yes, absolutely. So you mentioned gender a couple of times, and I would be remiss if we didn't talk about that. And I also see the majority of the women on this call shaking their heads yes when you're talking about your wives and you're talking about gender specific components. And also I know that there are men on this call as well. So I want to specifically address that because I think it's so important. And we know in the suicide prevention world how men and women, boys and girls are impacted differently. And so I guess the question is, what are your thoughts on how we address that slowly but surely as a society? And I know it's a big question, but I also know how thoughtful the two of you are, and that it's not just like your personal experiences. Dennis and Tommy, the other two folks in the book too, are also men. So there is something beautiful and specific about what you're doing to expand what we think about emotional intelligence for men and what that process looks like. Can you talk specifically about that?
I'm not sure that I can give any great advice. I think there has been some progress made in the years since our mothers took their lives by suicide. But there still is quite a bit of stigma around suicide, and men are expected to be stoic and buck up and get over it and, you know, move on with your life. And that's the way we grew up. That was the role model that we had at the time. I know that there are some people, some men who are much more emotionally open, but it's interesting that your observation watching the people on the call is that the women were shaking their heads yes. I think many of our wives would say, yeah, you know, tell me more than the facts. And even at times, David, as we were writing the book, was saying to me, Rick, you're explaining what happened, but you're not explaining what you felt at the time. And it is difficult to do. I'm not sure that I have any great suggestions there, though.
Well, it is difficult. I remember maybe a year or two after my mother's death, someone, an adult, said to me, it's time you got over this. And I remember thinking, there must be something wrong with me. I'm not getting over it. And I don't know whether that person was trying to get me to talk about it or just pass judgment, but I just fell further inside of myself. And I think it says a lot about us that until our wives pointed out to us how rare it was for men to open up the way we did in the book, we were unaware. That was news to us. And as I said, we had to convince ourselves that that was truly the case. And since we have published the book and had a chance to talk to some other men who have been down this road, we see some differences, but we still see much of the same. And the ending of the book, we changed at the last minute because of an experience that Rick had not too long ago that he shared with me the next day that reminded us all over again of that same point. Rick, that's your cue.
I was at, Ellen and I were at a dinner party. Some friends of ours threw, there were 4 couples there, and before dinner, the 4 guys were together talking, having a drink, and one of them had been a client of mine, and he said, well, Rick, since you retired, what have you been doing? And I went through the litany of things. I said, well, you know, I get to spend more time with the family, and I'm doing some more volunteer work, and we've traveled some, and I'm writing a book. And his question to me, obviously, kind of next obvious question is, well, what's the book about? And I very briefly explained it. And another of the men standing there said to me, oh, that's really quite a coincidence. My father took his life when I was in my early 20s. I was really surprised. And our host standing there said, well, Rick, I'll bet you when your book is published, people will come out of the woodwork with their stories about suicide and their families. So we went on. I mean, it wasn't a long discussion about the book. And at the end of the evening, Ellen and I were the last ones to leave and had helped clean up a little bit. And my friend was walking me to the door and he said, you know, I told you that it would be that people would come out of the woodwork about this. And I said, yeah. He said, well, my mother took her life when I was in my early 20s. Now, there were 4 men there, and 3 of the men had a parent die by suicide. I was flabbergasted, and that's what I wrote to David the next morning. And interestingly, this gentleman who was our host, who's become a pretty good friend and has talked to me quite a bit about it, had not even talked to his daughter or told his daughter, who is now an adult in her late 20s, that his mother had died by suicide. She knows it, but he's never talked with her about it and still feels uncomfortable talking to her about it. I'm sorry, I don't want to keep telling long stories and preempting any questions that people have. So.
Rick, it's a storytelling series. You're doing great. It's exactly. You actually have covered most of the questions too. So we're all in a perfect synergistic spot. Elizabeth is saying, thank you for sharing your story and that her aunt died by suicide and talking about the power of healing art. So all of the things that we've talked about, that's another great way to sort of build trust and also get yourself some healing if that's what works for you. And Verona is saying that you never really get over it. You just learn to live with it. So we have a few minutes left, but I know that many of us are willing to stay on the call if folks need that or want to do some additional chat. Someone else is saying, I need to run. Thank you so much. So good self-care for that person, Laura. Thank you. Yep. But I want to end on a hopeful tone. I had shared with you all earlier that when I first met you back in July, I was completely overwhelmed. And I said, I'm so grateful to know you, but I won't be able to read your book because I do not have the emotional space to do that right now. And you were beautiful and gracious to me. So thank you. But I did read the book and I said the opposite happened. It expanded my, my ability to sort of process, particularly in this really difficult time. So you have this friendship, you have all of these things that you've overcome, you have this connection around tragedy that has turned into this friendship and now this gift that you're giving to the world through your book. We've talked about how things have changed and words that weren't even used when you were young are being talked about in a format like this now. So I think we can take some solace in the evolution, but I would just love to hear from both of you what you're most hopeful about, even when we're going through this difficult time and what we can all kind of look forward to as we go through this process as a community.
I think, Carrie, you hit on a really good point that I think brings me to back to this notion of opening up that we have applied to being survivors of suicide loss, the need to talk about the person we lost and what it means to us and how that helps. One of the things we discovered since doing the book is, at least in our belief, that same notion of opening up, we think applies to people and folks around them who are facing the possibility of suicide, who are contemplating it, that the healing that comes with what seems like a very simple act, but really is a difficult one when you're in these circumstances, is the key to getting away from it. The idea of talking, realizing you're not alone. If you're, and I know looking back now with my mother, this happened over and over where she would speak to a psychiatrist or a psychologist and it would delay her to the next attempt. So there was at least hope that maybe she would find a way out of the vicious cycle that she was in. So I think the message hopefully will become more universal, and the more people who demonstrate what it does and talk about it, hopefully will make it easier for others.
I think there are a number of things that I think create some hope in me. We've certainly made progress in the decades since our mothers took their lives. And there are many more resources available now. The work that NAMI is doing nationally and certainly in Marin County, the fact that the county has focused attention on this issue and devoted some resources and created the collaborative is really encouraging. Here in Cleveland, there is an organization called Life Act that, excuse me, that goes into schools, much as the collaborative is trying to do, to help young people identify in themselves and in their peers the kinds of behaviors and attitudes that might indicate some mental health issues or a propensity towards suicide. These kinds of organizations and the tremendous research that has been done into mental health issues, and the fact that we're not quite there yet, but increasingly we're looking at mental health as a health issue, as opposed to something different or out there, or just, that person's just got an attitude problem. I think those things are really important. And the fact that Rodef Shalom has done some really innovative work in this regard is really encouraging. So there are many more resources available. People are really starting to look at these issues very differently. And I find that really encouraging. So thank you for asking the question, because it made me think about it a little bit, man.
Doing my job, Rick.
Yeah. And I know we're, as Kelly, as you said, David and I are happy to stick around and answer more questions, but I also want to be respectful of people's time. And I will say again that we would be thrilled to get comments, questions, or shared experiences on our email. We'll keep it confidential, but that email address again is sonsofsuicide2020@gmail.com. There it is. So, and there's our bench, our psychiatrist count. So thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Kara. Thank you, Moji and Joanne and Maria for inviting us to do this and for helping us with this. Really appreciate it.
I just got back on, so I got frozen out. Kelly, I just want to express our heartfelt thanks to you for the opportunities you've given us to share and to learn and to be a part of what you and your collaborative are involved doing on all of our behalf.
Thank you so much. And I mean it when I say it, you were really a gift to me. So, and to every single person who's on this call, if I know you, I would hug you. If I don't know you, I would not hug you. I would respect boundaries, but I would probably want to hug you. So just sending all the love and care that we possibly could as we continue to figure out how to get through this time. As David and Rick mentioned, their resources, they want to hear from you. Their email address is on the screen. Their book is on sale. So you can find out that information on Sons of Suicide book. They donate to organizations like Rick was talking about that do this work. So thank you everybody for being here. Reach out to us if you need anything. Take good care of yourselves. Love on your family, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.